Hello and welcome to today's session about payment risk. So we're talking about anomaly detection and sanction screening today. Before we actually start, let me spend a few words on the company that we're representing. So Ion operates in many different divisions, from Ion Markets, also data and analytics division, but we're representing Ion Treasury, which is the largest provider of treasury management solutions in the world. We cover we provide solutions for financial institutions, central banks, and corporations. And the portfolio of products you'll definitely know. So this includes solutions like Wall Street Suite, OpenLink, Reroute, ITS, City Financials, or Treasury. So I'm happy to present the first part of this presentation before I hand over to Nick. So what are we going to talk about today? So of course, we can't cover all the aspects of payment risk. So that's why we picked two very specific topics. One of those is detecting outlier using the full power of machine learning. And the other one, which Nick will present, is corporate sanction screening. We also have a Q&A sessions at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to submit the questions in the chat function. So let's start right away. So first of all, payment fraud and payment risk is really a huge topic. And of course, we can't cover all of that today, but I just wanted to highlight the different aspects of cybercriminality related to payment risk. And that's especially important for you as you're working in Treasury. You're an ideal candidate of being attacked. You oversee areas like bank connectivity, cash management, but also the management and operation of payments, including repetitive payments and large volume payments. And this slide just highlights a few aspects of payment fraud that ranges from the attacks to the IT infrastructure, like DDoS attacks, to attacking individual devices, all the way down to social engineering attacks and so on. And usually all those aspects are combined, or different approaches are used by attackers to actually commit payment fraud. So again, this slide is just there to be aware that we have to be sensitive to a wide range of attack scenarios. And on the next slide, I also just collected a few facts that you all know, and that is that payment fraud is indeed a topic. So when we just look at a few numbers, so there was a survey conducted in 2020. About 50% of the people answering the survey said that they had experienced fraud in the past 2 years, and also the pure amount of payment fraud has tripled in only 9 years. And something which is also pretty interesting, which I just wanted to bring to your mind, is that attackers don't always come from the outside. So that's what you see on the on the bottom part of the screen. So in about 40% of the cases, it's external fraudsters, but also in about 40% of the cases, it's internal fraudsters. And in 20% of the cases, external and internal attackers are colluding. So payment fraud, or cybercriminality in general, is a huge topic, and it can be really expensive if you fall victim to it. So knowing that, I think it's obvious that we also can't fight payment risk or payment fraud easily. So it's really many players that have to work together. So of course, we need policies and regulations that are effective or that are effective measures against payment fraud, we need people who understand those measures, who know the different attack scenarios, who know why those policies are in place, who understand different attack scenarios, and so on. And these people are, of course, people working in your IT department, in our IT departments. It's us from ION developing software, but it's also you using either a treasury management system or things like, an online banking solution for our private banking activities. And of course, we are a technology provider, and in today's talk, we're going to tell you more on what technology can do to assist people in fighting cybercriminality and to help implementing policies and regulations. The next slide is again something you might know. It's just a collection, which is far from being complete, of measures against payment fraud. You all know these measures, so you have those measures in place somewhere. Of course, you use systems that are secured with strong password rules, biometrics, or multi-factor authentication. Hopefully, you have systems in place that have strong IT security measures like encryption and so on. There are many rule-based measures, and just to be complete, we also put sanction screening on there. Nick will tell you more about that later. All these measures are, of course, extremely important, and we can't go without them. But they have one thing in common, and that is that we are reacting to known fraud scenarios. So we have to know that people use weak password rules. That's why we implement strong password rules. That's still not enough. That's why we implement multi-factor authentication. And you'll find examples for that for all these measures. So we know there typos can happen, or there is internal fraud. That's why we have make a checker in place. But I'd like to point to another aspect of payment fraud, and that is whether we can detect new kinds of fraud, novelties, things that we've not seen before. And can those measures react or find those threats? Not always. In some cases, yes. But first of all, I'd like to talk about what we'd actually like to find, and that are novelties or outliers. And one definition that I like pretty much is that an outlier is so much different from all the other data points that it's likely that it originates from a different process. So in that case, the data points are payments. So we want to find a payment that we've never seen before. And the different scenarios or the origin, that could be fraud, or it could be, for example, a typo. And can we find those with these measures? And in some cases, yes. So, for example, if I use my online banking tool and I add an IBAN and I enter some bank account number, then make a typo, then this is an outlier. It originates from a different process. I didn't copy the IBAN, but I entered it manually. And of course, we can easily detect that. There are IBAN validation rules in place, and we can easily notify users that something like that happened. But again, coming back to my point earlier, we have to know the validation rules first, and only then we can implement checks to find typos. And now I'd like to go over to a different approach, and that is by applying machine learning. And the fundamental difference to all the other measures that we've seen previously is that it's a data-driven approach. So we start by using data, which give that data to machine learning algorithms that are extremely good in understanding patterns and learning the behavior. And once we've learned that, that's called a so-called machine learning model. When we present new data to that model, we can detect deviations from that learned behavior and notify users in real time. So the goal is to really provide you with a real-time response to unknown attack scenarios. I mean, that's all a bit vague, I guess, because I know that that slide could stand for any machine learning application. And machine learning is really a huge topic. Everyone is talking about that. But I'd like to tell you in more detail how that actually works. And that's why I've collected an example. And that's what you see here. So that how that would work in practice. So this is, of course, an oversimplified example, but I think it does its job to explain how that works. So what you see here, each dot on the chart on the left-hand side represents a payment. I've plotted two flavors of payments: euro payments, GBP payments, and I've plotted it along two dimensions, along the amount and when it got created during the day. And we can see some behavior that we can easily understand. So that a Treasury organization probably operates in only one time zone during normal office hours, starting at 8 a.m., finishing at 6 p.m. or so. And this is the data that we feed into the machine learning algorithm. And then when we can learn the pattern, and then when we present that machine with new data, that's what you see here. That's what we see in red. It's again euro payments, so that would be in line with what we've learned. But something is odd. It happens at an unusual time of the day. So to us, that's a novelty or something new. It might be due to, I don't know, a new office opening in another time zone, but it can also be due to some fraudulent activities. And this is just a simplified example that highlights how those machine learning algorithms can be applied. And the fundamental difference to all the other approaches is that we do not have to put in rules in the first place. We do not have to tell their algorithms we only operate at normal working hours. No, this is all implicitly solved by the algorithms. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with rule-based systems. It's only those rule-based algorithms tend to get complicated pretty soon. And that's why we think that machine learning can help in those situations. So let's switch to a more realistic scenario. So how do these scenarios look like? So I've just collected two of them there. So one is an account takeover. So that happens, or many attackers try to take over an internal account, and there are already many places or many precautions in place. So strong password rules and so on and so on. But once an account takeover happened, it's really hard to spot. And this is where machine learning can help again. And this is, so we're looking at payment creation times, authorization steps, and so on. And with that, we can detect outliers and novelty right at the time when payments are made. Another attack scenario that happens pretty often is to reroute payments. That usually happens low and slow. So what do I mean with that? So when an internal or external fraudster They want to reroute payments to their account. So how do they make that? They make little changes in reference data or static data. So for example, they make changes to a known payee and only change the account number. So just imagine they do that together with many other static data changes. It's pretty easy that can be overlooked by, let's say, make a check and so on. And then usually nothing happens for quite some time. And after some time, payments are made to that payee. It looks quite normal, everything as usual, except for a different account number. And this is exactly what we can find with those algorithms. But then very often something really nasty happens, and that is if that payment goes through, that's usually a very small payment below some limit, then they repeat that 100 or 1,000 times. Can we spot that? Yes, we can. Again, using the same approach. So this is what you see on this screen here. So we're looking again at the behavior and on how payments are usually created. But now we don't look at one individual payment, but at aggregations of that. So what you see here is a histogram of payments. So again, we've plotted the payment creation time, and the larger the bar, the more payments happen during that time window. And what we do then is we learn that behavior, the density. That's the blue line here. So for example, over 1 year or so. And then we look at some other period, at new payments. Let's say all the payments that happened today or last week, last 3 days or so. And we can take deviations from that as well and can raise a red flag. Okay, so these were just a few examples on how these machine learning algorithms work out in reality. I hope I could give you some idea on how that actually works. And with that, I'm already at the end of my talk. So I hope that you believe me that machine learning can be a good complement to many standard anti-fraud measures, can easily be included in an STB workflow. And most important things maybe is that it's really a real-time reaction to unknown attack scenarios, and all that without the need for a hard to maintain rule set. Of course, whenever we apply machine learning, there are a lot of challenges ahead of us. So those algorithms are extremely powerful in providing results, but it's usually hard to get out why they came up with a specific solution. It's also something where we're working on currently. This is not live in any of ION's products yet, but we are going live with that within next year, and we are providing that through a central infrastructure. So it's really an easy way for all our products to integrate. And with that, I'm already done with my part of the talk, and I'm happy to hand over to Nick.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Parfitt, Head of Market Planning, and which means I essentially look after our financial crime compliance products, one of which is the corporate sanction screening offering, which is what I'm going to be talking to you today. And I really want to kind of make it clear and get through to you that from a corporate perspective, payment screening for sanctions risk is not just a nice to have, it's actually a regulatory requirement, and not something you really want to rely on your banking partners to perform for you. And then we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory environment behind that, how things are changing, what you need to be aware of from a Treasury perspective. And then we'll talk a bit about the Treasury solutions that we have in place and how we can make your lives a lot easier in that respect. But just to quickly remind you all as well that the question panel is open, so please do submit questions and we'll run through those at the end of my talk. So next slide, please, Peter. So a little bit of an introduction then, in terms of who are we. Although I work for Ion Analytics, we are a sub-company within Ion Analytics called Acuris Risk Intelligence. We started life as C6, a UK company that was founded around 2009. In 2016, they were acquired by Acuris, which is when I joined. So I've been with the company a little over 5.5 years. And then roughly 2 years ago, Acuris was acquired by Ion Group. So we're now being implemented into a function called Ion Analytics, which serves corporates, banking, advisory, and other segments as well. So I'm specifically focused today around the corporate exposure side and sanction screening and what that means for a treasury function. And I said we'll talk a bit about how that's integrated into our current TMS systems. Acuris Risk Intelligence, we are one of 6 global proprietary data vendors for sanctions information, politically exposed persons, adverse media or negative news, and also enhanced due diligence reports as well. So we're a global vendor. We're used primarily by financial institutions and many corporations. And we're used as a trusted data vendor in order for our clients to meet their regulatory obligations and their risk management as they adhere to the anti-money laundering rules and requirements, depending on the jurisdictions that they work in. Some of you may well be familiar with our £800 gorilla competitors, the likes of WorldCheck, now Refinitiv, Dow Jones, LexisNexis, and Comply Advantage. But what makes us different in the space is our approach to the data acquisition and how we curate our information. We use a combination of human intelligence as well as technology. So we have 100 plus researchers located across the world, primarily based out of Sofia in Bulgaria, but also capabilities in Shanghai, Singapore, Mumbai, the US, and Malaysia, as well as the UK. And our approach, we think, ensures that we provide our clients with very high quality profile information, so very rich profiles. We provide deep insights into that data as well. So there's a very strong historical component to this. As a company that goes back to 2009, we have a very rich and aged data set that our customers can take advantage of when doing deep analysis and research. And we are global by nature as well. So from a sanctions perspective, we cover all of the major sanctioned bodies and monitor around 230 odd different sources on a daily basis. And we think this approach really differentiates us in the marketplace in terms of ensuring that the information that we serve up is timely, relevant, and accurate. So when a change to a sanction list occurs, we update that data quickly, and then that becomes available directly to our clients. Next slide, please, Peter. So corporate sanction screening, what does this mean to you guys from a Treasury perspective? Well, as I mentioned before, it is a mandatory requirement for the Treasury function to screen payments, both incoming and outgoing. At a high level, sanction screening is really around ensuring that those individuals and businesses or entities that are placed on sanctions watch lists by various regulators and government bodies around the world are checked to ensure that essentially we're ensuring that payments aren't going to or coming from sanctioned individuals, so that their money isn't able to get into the financial system and that they can't carry out their nefarious activities. And we provide a list of this information that you check against using matching software. So the payment pairs of a remitter and receiver are screened directly through an algorithm, through our detection software, and If there's a match, then it's returned back for somebody in the Treasury function or within compliance is able to analyze the alert that's come back and determine whether or not it is actually a true match or not. And there is a degree of fuzzy matching associated with that by regulatory design. So we want to try and cast our net wide, but we also want to ensure that it isn't so wide that you end up generating an unmanageable number of alerts and blocking of payments. And from a business or treasury perspective too, it's really important to understand what your business's risk exposure is. Depending on the global nature of your business, who you interact with, your customers and partners, the types of products and services that you offer, will all determine your business risk essentially at the end of the day. And from a regulatory perspective, we talk very much about a risk-based approach to managing those sorts of alerts. And we can tune the algorithm and the solution to really match those requirements so that you're not producing a whole load of false positives in the process. But it is very much determined about from the business perspective around what that appetite looks like. Who does this impact? Well, really it impacts many different roles and stakeholders, both internally and externally to your business. Chief among those will be the Chief Financial Officer, the Treasury function, obviously, as that's where it lives, but also your heads of compliance, potentially general counsel and legal, all the way up to boards of directors, and really the broader society as well. From an anti-money laundering perspective, we have a duty and obligation to ensure that bad actors aren't banked within the financial sector and services. So we want to make sure that as a business you're not facilitating those sorts of payments. And I should also put in there as well that shareholders are also stakeholders and should be considered too. And the reason being is the reason for doing this beyond simply the global regulatory requirements is that compliance failures in this space can lead to very material fines and significant reputational damage. When we look at the financial services industry, or rather the largest fine to date was BNP Paribas around about 2011, when they were fined north of about $8 or $9 billion for knowingly breaching sanctions rules. And it wasn't simply the regulatory fine. And in my previous life and having worked for a number of tier ones too, it's not just the fine, it's the internal organizational drag as well. You don't want to be on the receiving end of this. It's very expensive, it's very time consuming, and it leads to a huge amount of internal organizational change, which is something that you really want to avoid at all costs. So how do they do that? Well, we implement a number of controls to ensure that these bad actors are caught before payments are made. So typically that's transaction screening and monitoring solutions. We look at ensuring that the data that you're screening against matches your business. So looking at global or local jurisdictional sanctions lists and sanction bodies, and providing a proper governance and reporting framework so that any risks that are flagged can be flagged up to the correct risk panels to make decisions on, and ensure that we aren't missing anybody when it comes to the screening process, or rather we're catching the right individuals at the right time. And we offer all of this through the ION Bank Connectivity Service, which is available for all ION Treasury Management solutions. Next slide, please, Peter. So some of the challenges when it comes to sanction screening, we had a look at a couple of reports here, one being in the 2019 Treasury Sanction Screening Survey report, and one from 2020. And I think these are still highly relevant today, and it'll be interesting to see when they rerun these reports, probably next year, to see how things have actually changed. The top 6 reasons that came back from the survey from corporations around can they do this effectively and what are the challenges that they're seeing. And number one on that is the burden of regulatory complexity. Sanctions is a highly specialized area, and we'll talk about the 50% rule shortly. but it's well worth bearing in mind that the regulatory landscape is different in different jurisdictions, and it can be very nuanced when it comes to understanding the entities that you can and cannot deal with. Typically, as you'd expect, the larger the organization, the more they're affected with compliance challenges. And that's not to be, that doesn't come as a surprise. If you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, you've got to ensure that you adhere to those local jurisdictional requirements, which means, greater rules, more compliance, more systems, and more controls in place. It's particularly when it comes to understanding the products and services that you offer. And point number 3, only 46% of respondent organizations screen all outgoing payments. That shows that there has been and still is a heavy reliance on your banking partners to perform this function for you. That opens up a material gap that if you're not screening, you may well be inadvertently paying sanctioned entities or individuals. Your bank may not catch that, but if they do, then payments are going to be returned, and there's a drag on the organization then in terms of customer experience and closing out those alerts and determining whether they are true alerts or not, which can lead to a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of time and wasted activity and efforts. Technology adoption is slow. There's huge opportunities to be made here by adopting technology to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Only 57% of respondents said their organizations would consider using, electronic or online sanction screening in the future. That's still pretty low, and we expect that figure to rise given the focus, which we'll talk a little bit about in terms of regulatory direction. But interestingly, nearly all respondents said that they realise and agree they have to, support and adhere to local obligations, and that they need to invest in tools that provides the best possible security in this space. So there's definitely a realisation that they need to do more, but it's a question of ensuring that that goes to the right levels of management to get the right levels of investment. And part of this session is really I'm hoping to give you a good education over why this is really, really important and why you must take it seriously. And then from the 2020 survey, we see that only 8%, we see 8% received and received payments to sanctioned parties, which was up by 1% in 2019. And that may not sound like a lot, but in reality, when you think of what that would mean to your organization, and if you were to have the regulators come knocking, that is actually a big challenge. Next slide, please, Peter. So the environment for sanctions in 2021 and beyond, in a nutshell, the legislation is not abating. It's only becoming ever more complicated, complex, ever more far-reaching. Primarily, a lot of sanctions legislation is driven by the US, but also by national jurisdictions such as the European Union and the global body, which is the United Nations. And I selected a quick statement around the increase of scope here for sanctions directives and the newish executive orders that came out of the US. Which, if you think about the implications for these 3 bullet points, sanctions are being aimed at individual and organizations who interfere with US or other foreign government elections. And if you just think about what that means, it's a very, very broad statement. Same applies to whether conducting, malicious cyber-enabled activities. It's very subjective, which means it can change, very, very quickly. And that means you have to react to it very quickly as well. And then finally, those who endorse corruption, assassination, and murder, or unlawful killing of US citizens. Again, these are very, very broad terms. And as I said, it means policies can change very quickly, and how do you react to that? Now, typically, this has always been very focused purely on financial institutions, or those covered by AML rules and regulations. But what I wanted to show here is that OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the US, the last couple of years has really shifted its focus away from the banking industry to the non-banking businesses, albeit fairly high risk type entities. So those that deal in maritime shipping, commodity traders, crypto companies, and e-commerce providers. Now, many of you may not actually be, in those businesses, but you may have relationships with companies that do. And that's by no means meant to be an exhaustive list. It's simply illustrative. So you need to think about that in terms of the broader context for risk management and what that means for your business and how you tailor your policies and procedures and ultimately your controls to meet that. And then other regulatory considerations that I think as part of a maturity framework to think where you sit in terms of compliance with sanctions today and where you want to be in the future, you only have to look at a number of US governing entities, such as the OCC and the New York Department of Financial Services, what their expectations have been in the past for financial institutions, where they provided guidance on model risk management, and also what they expect from compliance programs. And whilst you don't need to do that immediately, you need to think about how that builds into your programs of work over time. So sanctions compliance for Treasury is challenging. It's not going away. It's becoming more complicated, and the risks around non-compliance are material. Next slide, please. Now, what do we offer in this space? So I thought I'd just give you a quick overview here. We have ION's Treasury management systems, and what we've done is we provide an extension to the TMS, which is the sanction screening module. So typically, your TMS Treasury systems are going to be receiving a lot of accounts payable, a lot of accounts receivable files. It aggregates those, it nets them off, puts them into the settlement management process. If there are no violations, off it goes to the bank for straight-through processing, which is great. But as I mentioned before, if the banks are then doing their own screening, which they will do, and they're picking up on any sanctions risk, then you'll get payments coming back, and then it takes a lot of time in order to work that through. With the TMS extension, we're leveraging our own Acuris data set to do the sanctions matching process and alert generation. There's a full user interface that sits on top of this, which gives you, robust case management, the ability to look at why things were alerted, look at the algorithmic score behind that, and then make determinations about whether or not you are dealing with a sanctioned entity or not. All of this means that you can get that settlement management process and payment file clean, days ahead of it being fired off to the bank. So there's some real advantages to be had there in terms of the straight-through processing and reliance that STP will actually go through without there being any challenges. So it improves your customer experience and lowers your costs. Just on the right there, I thought I'd just briefly touch on the sanctions data sets. What you really want to look out for to ensure that whoever your provider is, or you're looking to have a provider in this field, you need to ensure that the data is global, it's comprehensive, covers all the major sanctioning bodies. We, as I mentioned before, have a dedicated research team looking at this on a 24/7 basis. If new sanctions changes are implemented, then we strive to get those curated into the system within about 2 hours. That may differ depending on the scope and size of the change, but we aim to do that as quickly as possible. And we've done a lot of work with our algorithm. We've done a lot of work with the way that our data matches to ensure that we really minimize those false positives, but also ensure that the true matches are not missed either because of algorithmic settings. And then, so just to go on finally onto the conclusion slide then, Peter. Sorry, there's one more, wasn't there? The 50% rule, my apologies. I'll just briefly touch on this because I know time is a little bit tight. This is something to be aware of for the 50% rule. Although it's been around since 2008, when you look at typical sanctions providers and lists, what they don't provide you with is really the UBO, the ultimate beneficial ownership information. So you may think that you're dealing with a non-SDN or specially designated national on the face of it, but actually when you follow the money, you follow the ownership structure, you can come a cropper because in fact there may well be more than 50% ownership And the graphic on the right just gives you a brief illustration that dealing with this German company at the start of the process within this, even going up 2 or 3 levels, it may look like you're still dealing with an STM, but when you really unpack and unlayer it, you start to see that Parfitt, which is a sanctioned bank in Iran, has ownership, and then ultimately that goes all the way up to full ownership by the government of Iran, which clearly Iran is a sanctioned entity. So, you know, the 50% rule is really important. I don't think you need to be afraid of it per se. You may not need to do it immediately, but it's something you may want to be aware of and build into your compliance programs. And maybe we can chat about that as part of the Q&A session. So then tying this all together on the conclusion slide, please, Peter. Peter touched on payment fraud, looking at the various fraud vectors that can impact your business. There's obviously a lot of exposure there. There's many attack vectors and methods. Cybersecurity is a huge problem in this space. But the use of machine learning, the use of anomaly pattern detection, and not novel and new ways of screening for that behavior against known behavior types, we think is a real advantage that will keep your organization safe. And then from a sanction screening perspective, I hope I've given you a good overview that it is a complex process. It's something that Treasury needs to do. Don't treat it as a tick box exercise. Treat it as being something that is a journey to how you get from simple compliance all the way through to much more mature compliance functions, dealing with the nuances of things like the 50% rule. So all through Ion Bank connectivity, we provide essentially the latest technology and services to help you mitigate against payment fraud trends and sanction screening exposure. Okay, that concludes our presentation. Just jumping to the questions page, we have a question here. How to ensure payment security when building a multi-bank TMS? Peter, can I hand that question over to you or just repeat it? The question is how to ensure payment security when having a multi-bank TMS.
I mean, for us, that's essentially the normal situation, because our treasury management systems usually are connected to multiple banks. And when we're talking especially about machine learning and AI, of course, that makes it more complex. So in my example, I hope I could elaborate on how this machine have to learn the behavior. And the more complex your behavior is, the more currencies you use, the more countries you're operating in, the more banks you're connected to. Of course, it's more complex to study behavior, but it essentially means that those algorithms need more data. But it works in the same manner. I hope that answered that question.
Thanks, Peter. I think we got time for just one more here as well. One for me here. What are the first steps treasurers need to do when setting up a compliance plan? Great question. Where does one start with all of this? So I would start with essentially an enterprise-wide risk assessment. I would work closely with the business to understand what your overall risk appetite is. So what sort of products and services do you provide? Where do you provide them? What level of internationality are you? And tie that to your known regulatory requirements for sanctions within one or many jurisdictions. I would then ensure that you take a risk-based approach when it comes to the payments that you are receiving and paying out as well. And if you've risk rated your clients, then also ensure that you address the highest risks first. It's essentially about having a risk framework as well. You don't have to do everything from day one, but ensure that you do have a plan, and that you can report on that plan, you've got the right stakeholder engagement at senior level, because as I showed before, your stakeholders are not just Treasury, but they can be the Chief Risk Officer, Chief Financial Officer, as well as the board and ultimately, shareholders too. So I hope that answered your question. I'm more than happy to go into that in more detail offline as well, if that helps. Just have a quick check if there was anything else on that. How are we doing for time? So he's saying, is payment and sanction screening the responsibility of the treasurer? Good question. Is it the responsibility of the treasurer? It depends. I would tend to say that I think the head of Treasury has a very important role. I would say you may not be fully accountable, but you certainly are responsible for that. But it really depends how you implement that overall function. I think from a culture perspective and where Treasury sits and by your very nature of screening payments incoming and outgoing, then really responsibility you should ask for that responsibility as well. I think it gives much better visibility in the organization too. And we do have a final question, but I'm not sure if we've got time to mention that. How are we doing? I think we might be slightly over. Go ahead. Okay, got the okay for that. How long does it take to screen bulk payment files, especially when there are thousands of transactions in the file? So again, I think it really depends. It should be very, very quick. With our architecture and our API integration, the way that we can scale with our cloud technology, it can be done, in semi-real time. But obviously that does depend on the size of the transaction file. It's a little bit like how long is a piece of string. I think what you need to balance it against is what is it that you actually need, because it comes at a cost. You have to spin up additional resources in order to do that screening. If you need it back in a much quicker time, you may be able to do it on a risk-based approach. So your lower risk clients, you could screen in a semi-offline way and have the transactions back. So I think it really needs to be a business decision on that in terms of what is the criticality of having those alerts, and also the size of your organization. So I hope that answered your question. Okay, I can't see any more for the moment. So with that, I will hand back to the organizers. And just to say thank you all very much for your time today.